was 1948, and Chuck Yeager, the famed test pilot, was flying a brand new North American F-86 Saberjet over a lake in the Sierras when he decided to buzz a friend's house near the edge of the lake. During a slow roll, he suddenly felt his aileron lock, and the plane went out of control. And says Yeager, "It was a hairy moment, flying about 150 feet off the ground and upside down." A lesser pilot might have panicked with fatal results, but Yeager let off on the G's, pushed up on the nose, and sure enough, the aileron unlocked. Climbing to 15,000 feet where it was safer, Yeager tried the maneuver again and again. Every time that he rolled, the problem reoccurred. Yeager knew that 4 pilots had died under similar circumstances, but to date, investigators were puzzled as to the source of the Saber's fatal flaw, since no pilot had lived to explain the experience. Upon landing, Yeager went to his superior with a report, and the inspectors went to work. They found that a bolt on the aileron cylinder was installed upside down. Was it a problem with the design? No. The blueprints clearly designated the bolt being installed in the opposite direction. So what had happened? Well, the culprit was eventually found at the factory. It was a mechanic on the assembly line who ignored instructions about how to insert that one bolt, because by golly, after all his years on the job, he knew that bolts were supposed to be placed head up and not down. Ignoring the directions given by the designer and choosing instead to go our own way, believing that we know better, with fatal results. It's a powerful lesson, and it raises the question, in our lives today, who is in charge? Who is setting the course of action? Are we more often going our own way, thinking that we know better, and is this getting us into all sorts of trouble and danger? Or are we seeking to follow the guidance of our designer into life as intended? Obviously, the wise person follows the guidance of the designer of life, and this is something of what I'd like to talk about this morning, opening our lives better to God's direction. Today, in our continuing study of the Exodus, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, has finally been convinced, forced really, following the 10th plague against him, the death of the firstborn, to let the people of Israel go and to free them from their captivity and slavery in which he has been holding them. They now begin their journey out of Egypt, and as the text describes for us, God doesn't leave them to just sort of, find their own way to freedom, just sort of hope that it works out for them. No, God knows that they need help, that they don't really know where they are. I mean, they've been slaves in Egypt for generations. So God's personal care for them continues as God now steps in to lead them to the life he wants for them. God's guiding presence with them taking the form of a pillar of cloud and fire, cloud during the day and fire lighting up the night. Now, this method of leading the people will continue throughout the rest of the story. We will hear mention of this repeatedly in the chapters ahead. Until the people get to the promised land, this is how God will guide them. And I believe that this imagery is thus meant to speak to the people of faith, to people like us, in all times. Namely, that this is something that God provides for us as well, for all people of faith who turn to him. That is, God obviously doesn't, set pillars of cloud and fire out in front of each of us, showing us the way through life. I mean, it might be nice occasionally if he did, but just imagine we have traffic problems now. You can imagine traffic problems with this. Now, this is something for that specific place and time, but that doesn't mean that God isn't seeking just the same to guide us through life. He is. As we've seen throughout, the story of the Exodus is not simply a tale of some isolated group of people long ago. Rather, it is a story that points ahead to events fulfilled in Jesus Christ. In him, crucified and risen, is our Exodus, our being set free from captivity to slavery and to sin and death, set free to journey forth to life as God intended, our journey on to the promised land. Jesus is the spiritual fulfillment of the Exodus. Thus, we know that what takes place in this story is our story as well. Specifically, that those who are set free through faith in Jesus Christ can trust that like their spiritual ancestors long ago, the Lord is here now to guide us on to life as he intended. The wise person recognizes this and is seeking out this leading of God every day. So what do we learn here about better following this direction? A couple of thoughts. I'd like to offer 4 rules for following God's guidance through life. Rule number 1, resolve to be led. As mentioned, the key issue that initiated God's guidance of the Israelites once they had been set free is the awareness that they had no idea where to go, They didn't have a map of the world. Such things barely even existed, let alone possessed by some slaves, Left to their own devices, they were in deep trouble. They needed help, and they knew it. And this is where they began, and this is where we need to begin as well. In the awareness that we need help, that on our own, we're in trouble. We just don't know the way through life. Now, having said this, this is exactly, of course, where the trouble begins for us, right? I mean, let's face it. While we also often call out to God to help guide us through life, to show us the way, most especially when we're in trouble, truth be told, our seeking is generally less to be shown the way and more to try to get God in line with our plans, right? It's like I remember once hearing this story about a pastor. He was trying to lose some weight, and he put himself on a diet, but it was tough. He loved sweets, most especially donuts, Didn't help that his name was Reverend Duncan, okay. But, he loved donuts. He's on this diet, but every day he has to pass a donut shop on his way to the office, right? Well, one morning as he drove to work, he prayed, "Now, Lord, if it is your will for me not to have any donuts this morning, you make sure there are no parking places in front of the donut shop." Well, later that morning, the pastor prayed the following: "Lord, I ate 3 donuts today, since obviously it was your will that I have them. After all, there was an open parking spot right in front of the donut shop, and it only took 8 trips around the block for it to open up." Right, Sound familiar? Right. We get ourselves in trouble. We never journey on to life because so often we make our lives more about leading God than being led by God, right? We give lip service to following God's guidance, but then we have no intention of really following. We know what we want, and we demand that God give it to us. We refuse to admit our neediness, that on our own, we're going to louse up. I mean, I don't know about you. I barely make it through a day, let alone an hour, without lousing up somehow, right? We need to recognize our neediness, that we're going to louse up, and that we don't know the way, right? Well, people who God can lead on to life know their need, and they resolve to be led. They resolve to quit telling God what to do and how things need to go, and instead they surrender to being given instructions constantly, to repent, to forgive that person, to go apologize maybe, to let go or to reach out, whatever. Notice how in the text, God doesn't immediately guide the people in the direction that makes any sense to them, right? But that's because God knows their weaknesses and what they really need and what's best for them. As long as we are still telling God how things need to go, God can't do anything with us. This is the constant test in life. Am I trying to get God in line with me, or me in line with God? Right? Someone once said that God always gives his best to those who leave the choice up to him. Right? First, most basic, is a fundamental rule in following God's guidance through life: resolve to be led. From this, then, rule number 2, look for the signs. Returning to the text, the people of Israel were led by a pillar of cloud in the day and a pillar of fire at night. That is, they had these specific things that they were supposed to look to, things that were meant to get their attention and point them in the direction that God wanted them to go. Right? Now, as noted, we don't have these same kind of things today, but I believe the spiritual point is still made, that God, in guiding us through life, frequently offers us signs that are meant to sort of get our attention and to point us in some direction that he wants us to go, to some place where God may be up to something, right? And there's blessing and life in abundance. Now, we can recognize these signs because, like a pillar of cloud and fire long ago, they're unusual occurrences that seem to speak of something special going on. And the trick is simply being willing to explore such moments. To put it another way, the next step in discerning God's guidance in our lives is being observant. Right? It's constantly looking around, and when we see some unusual event happening, like in a moment or a word that's spoken or a person in need, something tugging at our hearts, to be open to responding to this, to engaging it, and seeking what God may be up to here. What God there waiting to meet us with some unexpected blessing. As an example, consider the following true story. In May of 1990, the cargo ship Hansa Carrier was hit by a severe storm during its voyage from South Korea to the United States. And in the middle of the tempest, a large wave swept 21 shipping crates into the sea, 5 of which contained Nike shoes. About 6 months later, a very dedicated beach scavenger named Steve McLeod spotted a clump of Nike shoes while walking along the Oregon coast. Then he noticed another and another, and several piles of this gleaming plastic footwear. Something inside him moved him to begin collecting the shoes. He wasn't even sure why, but something moved him, and so he began to gather them up. Soon McLeod's apartment was packed with several styles and sizes of Nikes, each of which he carefully cleaned and dried and sort of debarnacled. There was only one problem. The vast majority of the shoes were left-footed. There were no matched pairs, none. Right? McLeod was the butt of many jokes from family members and friends for his useless collection of left-footed shoes. Okay? His collection, however, attracted the attention of local scientists working to decipher the Pacific Ocean's currents. And with the help of Nike and the Hansa crew, they determined that the shoes had not been connected during their ocean voyage. Furthermore, the slight toe curvature of the right-footed shoes caused them to track northeastward into the Alaska current, while the left-footed Nike slid neatly into the southeast-bound California current. Thus, for months, a small physical difference forced each shoe farther and farther away from its mate. Once Steve McLeod had put these pieces together, he began contacting other known scavengers for news of another Nike windfall. And sure enough, he heard about a large number of Nike shoes that had been beached to the north along Queen Charlotte Sound. A meeting was arranged, and in one day, 1,200 pairs of Nike tennis shoes were reunited using their serial numbers. Right? Once each pair became whole again, Steve, he had an idea. He had all the shoes cleaned and sanitized, and they were sent off to a local homeless shelter. And that day, 1,200 needy people, young and old, gratefully walked in brand new expensive shoes because one person chose to step out in faith on just a crazy prompting from the Lord. And the Holy Spirit led him to something great, right? And the point is, God wants to do the same for us every day. Rule number 2 in following God's guidance into rich blessing: look for the signs. Which leads us into rule number 3: be prepared to stop. Right? A little bit later in the Exodus story, we're told the following regarding the leading of the pillar of the cloud and fire. It says, "Sometimes the cloud would remain from evening until morning, and when the cloud lifted in the morning, they would set out. Or if it continued for a day and night, when the cloud lifted, they would set out. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a longer time that the cloud continued over the tabernacle resting upon it, the Israelites would remain in camp and would not set out. But when it lifted, they would set out." Notice the point. The pillar not only led the people as they moved, showing them where they're supposed to go, it also told them when to stop, right? Stopping was just as much a part of God's guidance as was the moving. And this is extremely important. Think of it this way. Out on the road as we drive our cars, there are traffic lights at intersections. Now, on these traffic signals, are there only green lights? No. Of course not. There are also yellow and red lights. Sometimes we are told to go. Sometimes we are told to slow down and stop. Of course, in New Jersey, we consider a yellow a speed-up sign, but that's a whole other thing. But anyway, if there were only green lights, there would be nothing but accidents, right? It's the same thing with life itself. When people do nothing but go, 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 they crash and burn, right? Very important spiritual principle. Sometimes God's guidance is seeking to direct us toward where we need to go next, but just as often, God's direction is to go nowhere, right? To just stop for a moment along the journey. And why? Well, for a number of reasons. First, obviously, unlike God, we are finite beings. We have limited resources of energy. We regularly need to stop and rest. We be refreshed. Secondly, there's also the issue of timing. Frequently God's working on some absolutely wonderful thing for our lives, but the pieces required to make this happen aren't quite in place yet, and it takes time. So God's kind of saying, I have something really wonderful in store for you, but you need to wait for a moment. Can you just let it happen? Most importantly, though, the issue is generally one of simply receiving the gift of life. That is, so often we are so busy racing along, so hung up on looking at where we need to get to, the problems we need to resolve, that we fail to receive the blessing of where we are right now. We're so hung up on getting life that we actually miss it, right? So God comes to us and essentially says, my direction for your life today is to go nowhere, right? Trust me, I will get you where you need to be. I will get you to life abundant, but to ever get there, you need to learn how to receive life itself. Instead of taking the next step in your life, try looking around at where you now are. Kiss your spouse. Hug your kids. Enjoy the meals you eat today. Spend some time with friends. The journey will wait for you. Learn to wait for it. Author Eugene Peterson, he puts it this way. He says, busyness is the enemy of spirituality. It is essentially laziness. It is doing the easy thing instead of the hard thing. It is filling our time with our own actions instead of paying attention to God's actions. This is one of the hardest parts of following God's guidance. It's obeying the instruction to stop, right? This morning, as you are seeking God's instruction for the next step in your life, perhaps you're desperately seeking that. How today might God simply be instructing you to just stop for a moment, And are you obeying that instruction? Consider the following true story. About a decade ago, at a Christian conference in Houston, Texas, a speaker by the name of Marty Ensign, a missionary to Africa, she told of bringing many years ago some African pastors to the United States for a great big meeting. And during their free time, these pastors, they went to go shopping. Now, they were from a very, very rural part of Africa and had never spent much time in a modern industrialized city. And Marty knew that there was a chance someone might have difficulty or maybe even get lost. So she gave them her phone number for just such an emergency. And in less than an hour, the phone rang and one of the pastors said, we're lost, right? And Marty said, well, we'll go to the nearest intersection, find out the names of the two streets at the corner, and then tell me, and I'll come and get you. In a few moments later, the pastor came back online, and he said, we are at the corner of walk and don't walk. Right? And Marty said she had to chuckle. Well, obviously, these visitors, big city, they'd never seen pedestrian crossing lights, and they were mistaking these for the street signs. But the event also taught a great lesson. Not only of how often in all of our lives do we make the mistake of taking our directions from the wrong signs, right? But even more that in life, sometimes the instruction is to walk, and sometimes it is don't walk. Just stay still where you are, right? It has been said that the stops of a good person are ordered by God as well as the steps. Rule number 3 in following God's guidance into life, be prepared to stop. And then finally, rule number 4, keep God in front. One final time, returning to our text today, notice how our reading today concludes. The Lord went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. Now, it seems like an obvious thing, but you notice that last line. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. In front of the people. They kept the pillar. They kept God in front of them, right? Final instruction, final rule here. It's seemingly obvious, but it's so often overlooked that to be led by God, God has to be out in front of us, right? How often are we praying for God's leadership in our lives, but what we're actually doing, what we're actually living, is God behind us somewhere, which we're making him come up and fix everything we've just done, right? In the text, in the Exodus story and throughout the Bible, notice how God never gives his people the whole picture up front, the whole map of their journey. Now God probably does this for a variety of reasons. Partly because the map is somewhat in flux, depending on various changes that can occur. And also because frequently, if God showed us the whole path of our lives, there are many places we wouldn't go, right? But we need to go there to find life. But the point is that we are not given the whole map. Why? Because we don't really even need it, right? All we need is the next move, right? And if we will just resolve to keep stepping forth into each new day, striving to put God out in front of us, seeking his will, his ways, his desires and everything, God will bring us through in the end to the promised land. Final rule here, keep God in front. Each day, whatever it brings, wherever you find yourself, strive to make it somehow about God, and God will meet you there with life. One author writes, put God in front of your life, not your life in front of God. I learned this lesson well a few years back when my wife died. Pain and loss came to consume and control my whole life. I couldn't get beyond it. And I wouldn't have, I firmly believe, if I hadn't accepted my pastor's invitation to help start a new grief counseling ministry in our church. Somehow in building this ministry, the more I reached out to help others, the more it helped me. The more I simply tried to fill each day with something good, it left no more room for the bad. Every day another life helped, another family saved. The sadness still comes, the grief still rears its ugly head at times. The pain is still there, always there. But there's so little room for it. There's so much more good now. God led me through death on to life. I needed only to put him in front of me each and every day. Somebody once said, God's guidance is like a small lamp in a very dark forest. It doesn't show everything at once, but does give just enough light to keep each step safe. This week, let God lead you through each step onto life. Resolve to be led, look for the signs, be prepared to stop, and keep God out in front. Let us join together in singing our closing hymn, number 128, He Leadeth Me. Would you please stand?